Okay, here we go. So first of all, the Fraser River salmon canning industry is certainly one of the best known and most intensively studied of BC's aspects of BC's history by a range of both amateur and professional researchers alike. Consequently, one might ask a couple of questions. First of all, what more needs to be said? And second of all, how might we find new and innovative ways of doing so? Actually, there are certainly a number of innovative ways of approaching this history, but it certainly does take a bit of creativity. Drawing on the title of this series, over the past decade or so, I've used archaeology to quite literally uncover the secrets and hidden histories flowing from the very banks of the waterway itself. For my PhD at Simon Fraser University, which I completed in 2009, I conducted archaeological survey and excavation on the remains of the former Ewan cannery on Don and Lion Islands, immediately adjacent to Annacis Island along the Fraser in Richmond. The Ewan cannery was built by pioneer New Westminster salmon canner Alexander Ewan and operated between 1885 and 1930. However, the main buildings remained in use through the 1970s as a fish camp and later as a marine gas station. I could have added another sentence in there. Typical of early canneries, it comprised an industrial complex at the western end of Lion Island, plus a series of racially segregated work camps spread out across both islands. These included things like the manager's house, a Chinese bunkhouse, 2 Japanese fishing camps, and 2 as yet unidentified bunkhouses on Lion Island. Now, the Chinese bunkhouse, located in close proximity to the industrial complex, was a 2-story L-shaped structure that could accommodate up to 100 men. Chinese cannery workers were hired on an annual basis by a labor contractor who also provisioned the bunkhouse, often from his own import company. In 1901, a Japanese entrepreneur named Jinsaburo Oikawa founded a fishing settlement on neighboring Dawn Island, eventually home to a population of between 70 and 100 men, women, and children. And this settlement was occupied year-round, and besides fishing, included things like small-scale commercial agriculture and sake brewing ventures. In 2006, the Japanese-Canadian community celebrated the arrival of an important group of immigrants brought to Canada by the founder of the Dawn Island Japanese fishing community. Celebrations included things like dedication of a historical plaque on the mainland opposite the islands and the planting of 2 ceremonial cherry trees. The buildings, of course, are now all gone, and very little remains of the cannery today, aside from a series of pilings, several large steam boilers, and other debris from the industrial complex. This includes tin scraps from the can-making process, casually discarded amongst the pilings. Now, the rest of the islands are thoroughly overgrown, with very, very little evidence visible on the surface today. Consequently, my fieldwork, which took place between 2005 and 2006, began with surface mapping and shovel testing to narrow our focus, followed by excavation of a series of small square test pits to recover artifacts from the cannery days. Now, fieldwork spanned nearly an entire annual cycle from summer through the next spring, and as a result, I experienced firsthand many of the conditions to which seasonal cannery workers and year-round residents would have been exposed. Sometimes these were highly pleasant, other times not so much. The highest tides, of course, often interfered with my work schedule. In fact, one day I almost lost my equipment box. There it is floating down the river. Despite all of this, what did we find? Essentially what follows is a series of object-based sound bites, if you will, of what we think we've learned about cannery life from this academic exercise. First of all, ceramics from the Chinese bunkhouse indicate residents relied almost exclusively on cheap, multi-purpose bowls imported from China. This is likely a product of the racially enforced low economic status, the seasonal nature of the work, and the profit-maximizing tactics of the labor contractors who also provisioned the camps. In contrast, Japanese fishermen negotiated their own cannery contracts and provisioned themselves. And this is evident archaeologically in the greater abundance and diversity of ceramic tablewares and other consumer goods recovered from their camp. Now, Asian cannery workers also used locally available Canadian clothing and other products, much more so at the Japanese camp than at the Chinese bunkhouse. And I've suggested that this may be linked, at least in part, to government-mandated westernization and industrialization ongoing in Japan beginning in the late 19th century. This is evident with beverage bottles, for example, recovered from the Japanese camp, which in addition to locally available products included things like sake, beer, and soda imported from the homeland in Japan. Now, beer and soda were actually first introduced to Japan in the late 19th century and then re-exported to North America as distinctly Japanese products, many of which can actually still be bought locally today. Now, a number of Asian and Euro-Canadian medicine bottles were recovered from the Chinese and Japanese camps. New arrivals in Canada faced things like medical exams and quarantine, and Asian immigrants may have preferred to self-medicate rather than visit local doctors and face further quarantine or possibly deportation. Now, one intriguing find from the Japanese camp was a commemorative pendant from the 1905 Dominion Fair in New Westminster, which quite literally says, "Meet me at the Dominion Fair." And what's interesting is that in an environment of severe anti-Asian exclusion, this memento suggests that community members were able to participate in at least some community events. Now, 2013 saw two important developments in my nearly decade-long relationship with the UN Cannery. First of all, I published a scholarly book based on my findings at the Chinese and Japanese camps. And secondly, I returned to the islands as leader of an SFU undergraduate field school in archaeology. A focus of our work was to actually explore the remains of two unidentified bunkhouses on Lion Island to compare with the two Asian camps, which I'd looked at previously. But of course, first we need to figure out who occupied them. Was it Euro-Canadians or First Nations? Was it men or women? The fact is we still don't know yet. So ultimately, I guess I'll conclude by saying thank you and stay tuned.